Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenny Tharp, and I serve on our First Impressions team. We're the people you see in the parking lot and wearing red shirts inside. We love to lead the way in creating a welcoming and friendly environment at church each week. If you've ever wondered about getting involved with our team, feel free to talk to me or anyone wearing a red shirt before you leave. Right now, I get to bring our scripture reading from James chapter 4. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who is not opposing you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
My name is Nathan. I'm on staff here at the church, and I got 4 daughters at home, and board games, and I've said this before, board games are an incredibly helpful parenting tool for us with our kids. They teach you perseverance and how to stick with hard things, how to handle things like defeat, and also the emotional scarring from your parents. And so a few months ago, my family was playing a game, and it's a very similar game to the game Sorry, if you've ever played the game Sorry, but it's a little more complex than that. Basically, you've got 4 marbles. Everybody has 4 marbles. You have to move them around the board and get them back into your home base kind of thing. But unlike Sorry, where you're just drawing random cards and you got to follow the instructions, you play in rounds. Everyone gets dealt cards, and you can use those cards at different times to kind of strategize and move your stuff. And so at one point in the game, I gave some advice to one of my daughters about something she was going to do in the game, and it worked. It helped her. At first, until she had a sister who came up behind her and jumped on top of her marble and sent her marble home, which of course led to my daughter looking at me and going, this is you. You did this to me. You knew this was going to happen. And so it was this whole little crisis, which of course led me to be a little defensive. But more than that, it gave a good moment for a good little dad lecture to go on. And so I got into a dad lecture, hey, this is just like life, right? This is just like life in that you can count up your marbles. You can have the best strategy you want, but you don't get to determine what cards you get dealt, and you don't get to determine what other people are going to do in the situation. And so sometimes, no matter how good your plan is, no matter how far you plan in advance, you don't get to determine how your life is going to turn out, which I thought was really good advice. Actually led her into a deeper existential crisis at the middle of the table where she goes, this is what life is like? And so she's freaking out, imagining her future. And while she is, I noticed one of her marbles was defenseless. And so I bounced on top of it and sent her butt home because I'm a savage. And because I've read the book of James, which says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of all kinds. And sometimes your biggest trial is having me as a dad. So you got to remember that. But if you've been here for this series, you might, or if you haven't been here for this series, you might be wondering, why do you consider it pure joy when you face trials of all kinds? Well, he says it's because the testing of your faith, or the testing of your pistis, which is the Greek word, well, it produces something in you. It produces perseverance. Now, as you know, if you've been here throughout this series, that little word pistis, or faith, has really been the focus of what we've been talking about. We're trying to get a bigger picture in our minds of what it really means to have faith in Jesus, or as we've been saying, to really have my allegiance be to King Jesus above all other things. Most of our ideas about faith are about, they're about ideas. They're about what I believe to be true. And by believe to be true, I mean facts that I kind of know are true, and I hold them in my mind. And as long as I hold the right facts to be true in my mind, then I'm a person of great faith. But we've been seeing throughout this study of the book of James that faith is bigger than just what you believe to be true in your mind. It certainly includes what you believe to be true in your mind, but it's bigger than that. It's about how do those beliefs, those ideas get embodied, meaning how do they take root in my life? How do they change how I live? How do they change how I speak? How do they change how I think and how I interact with other people? It's ultimately about what Jason has already said, giving authority to Jesus over your life. It is about saying, if I believe Jesus is king, then he has authority over everything in my life. To be a person of great faith is to be a person who holds Jesus as their highest authority. A person who holds allegiance to King Jesus. And so James says you should let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And what James is not saying is that, hey, when you go through hard things, just make sure you hold all the right ideas about God. Don't ever doubt your ideas about God. Don't ever question your ideas about God. That's not what James is saying. What he's saying is make sure you continue in faithful obedience and allegiance and love and devotion and trust to Jesus. Even if you're not fully sure about everything, if you will keep walking towards Jesus, even when life is hard, even when you face trials of every kind, that person becomes mature and complete in a way that the person who just has the right ideas about God but never walks towards him ever does mature. It's the person who continues in their faithful allegiance to Jesus. And it seems like when James is writing to probably a group of churches, not one church in particular, but he primarily seems to be writing to churches that the biggest thing they are facing, the biggest trial they are facing is financial hardship, or maybe even financial persecution. And I don't have time to go back through the whole letter to talk about why that's true, but there's one section where James even says to them, why is it that you want to be rich? Because isn't it the rich who are persecuting you? Isn't it the rich who are dragging you into court? And what this means is, in the ancient Roman world, and it's not vastly different in our society, if you're going to be dragging people into court constantly, you got to have some money to make that happen. And so at times where it was illegal in the Roman system to be a Christian, it was the rich who would often bring maybe a servant or maybe someone who was a lower status to them into the courts and say, hey, these people are not, they're Christians and this is illegal. And then when their assets get seized, the rich can take their assets. So it was financially beneficial for the rich to drag these Christians in. And so what he's saying is it's the rich who are making it where you've lost money or you've lost jobs or family members have been put in prison and you've lost a lot of income. He is primarily talking to people who are struggling financially. And this is an important thing because what we just heard Kenny read to us from James are not words written to people who are struggling financially. He talks about wealthy merchants who are going, I'm going to make this plan to go to this town and I'm going to live there a year and I'm going to sell a bunch of stuff and make a bunch of money and then I'll come back. And then he says, you rich people who have employees, y'all should weep and wail. And so what scholars have done is they've kind of looked and gone, how does that writing match up with the writings of saying everyone seems to be financially poor? And what some scholars point to is James may not be writing these words to people in that church. He may be doing what it's called prophetic writing, which is you start to critique things that are going outside the church to provide hope and security and to warn the people in the church, don't become like this. Don't move towards this. And because in the ancient society, it would have been natural for them to assume if God blesses someone, he's going to bless them financially. If God's going to bless somebody, what's going to happen is their life is going to get easier. I mean, if God's going to bless somebody, they're going to get some money. Their business will grow. Their family will get better. Everything will just keep going up and to the right for them. It is a natural thought in the ancient world. No one in our modern world would ever have thoughts like this. If I follow Jesus, I'm going to get a better life. My money's going to grow. Things are going to go a little bit better for me. Everything's going to go the way I want it to go. And James is trying to warn them, when you start pursuing that, there is danger on the other side. We live in the richest nation in the history of the world. Not just the richest nation currently. In the history of the world, there has never been a group of people who have had as much money as we do. And even if you don't feel very rich, the statistics are not on your side. The median household income in Coweta County, so this is combined household income, people working in a house, is $100,000. So if you're somewhere around $100,000 combined household income, which is the median household in Coweta County, you are richer than 91% of the rest of the world. 91% of the rest of the world. If you gave away 10% of your income at $100,000, you would still be richer than 90% of the rest of the world. You would still be richer than that. The problem is most of us don't feel that. We don't feel it because the myth of greed is that if I was rich, I wouldn't have any trouble in my life. That's the myth. The myth is if I had more money than I needed, well, then I wouldn't struggle in any way whatsoever. I could kind of buy my way out of problems. I wouldn't get stuck with things I didn't want. I wouldn't get stuck in a job I don't want. I wouldn't get stuck in a house I don't want. I wouldn't get stuck with people I don't want. I can just kind of move things around and get to where I want to go. And most of us go, I ain't got that life, so I'm not rich. See, in the game of life, the way we think of it is money is the way that you stack the deck in your favor. That's the way we say it. The rich have rigged the game of life. They got everything going in their favor. It gives you an upper hand. There may be some things. I mean, think about the game of life. I said, you can't count up your marbles and you can do everything the way you want. We think, well, if I'm rich, it don't matter what another player does because I got more cards to throw out. I can kind of make things go the way I want it to go. We think some things in life may be out of my control, but money is an ever-present help in times of trouble. And in this way, money becomes what Jesus said it would. The biggest competition for our allegiance to him. Because the myth of greed is that I can secure my future. There may be some things in life that are unpredictable. The economy may get unstable. The government may get unstable. If I got enough money, I can determine everything goes the way I need it to go. I can rig the game of life in my favor. But James says this is a lie we need to fight against.
All throughout his letter, James has been urging these early believers struggling in life, perhaps with financial troubles or persecution, to persevere in their faithful allegiance to Jesus. And what kind of allegiance does Jesus desire? Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Jesus desires allegiance that leads us to care for those who cannot care for themselves. A few verses later, James presses the point. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So imagine, if you are suffering under financial trials, like these believers, what does it mean to persevere in allegiance to Jesus and his way? James says it means continuing to meet the needs of others. Now that requires real faith. Imagine not knowing the next time you'll have work or where your next meal will come from, and yet you remain faithful to care for someone else in need. That takes genuine trust in King Jesus. And so just before the words from our scripture reading today, James instructs these Christians, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. This is the posture of those who live in allegiance to Jesus. This is what it takes to persevere in obedience to his way, even when it's difficult. It requires humility. Humility is recognizing that I am not at the center of all things. My life is not a story about me and my plans. My story is caught up in the story of Jesus. I don't get to determine every outcome. My role is to learn to live in submission to Jesus and his will. And James promises, if I humble myself before him, he will lift me up. Then James seems to turn and critique a lifestyle that stands in direct conflict with humble submission. He says, "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money." Scholars such as Daniel Ng note that James doesn't address these people as brothers and sisters. That's striking because throughout his letter, James uses that phrase more than any other, even more than faith or allegiance. But here he says, "Now listen, you who say," suggesting he may not be speaking directly to fellow believers, but warning the church about a cultural mindset that is dangerous to allegiance with Jesus. James tells this little parable about traveling merchants who plan to make more money in the future. He challenges them. Why you do not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. James is confronting the illusion of control. You think your detailed plans and your accumulated wealth give you security, but you don't even know if you'll see tomorrow. To be clear, James is not saying that planning for or saving wisely the future is wrong. Scripture speaks elsewhere about the wisdom of this. His warning is about a deeper attitude, the assumption that our plans and our money can secure our future. Instead, James insists, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. This doesn't mean that we must tack Lord willing onto every plan as a sort of superstition, as though saying the right words guarantees success. That would be another way of trying to control God. James is calling us to realize that our lives are not in our hands. Our future belongs to God. We can plan, but ultimately, his will determines what happens. Jesus told a parable that drives home the same truth. A rich man's land produced an abundant harvest. He had more than he could ever eat. And instead of sharing with the poor, he decided, I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. There I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. He had a solid plan to secure a good and pleasing future for himself. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? You thought that your money secured years of good living? You won't even see tomorrow. And Jesus concludes, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. And James is carrying the same warning to the churches he's writing to. Your money doesn't give you control over your life. Only God controls your life. So humble yourself in submission to him and trust that in due time, he will lift you up.
So the idea that James seems to be going at in both of these sections that we've already heard Kenny read is that the idea that money or my own plans or my own wisdom can secure a future for me is a lie. But it doesn't feel that way. Because if you look at the world, it seems like the wealthy are doing pretty good for themselves. And it seems like if there's a game of life, they're the ones who are winning at it. And it often doesn't feel like they're even winning because they did things the right way. It doesn't just feel like, well, they were more like Jesus, so they got a lot more money than the rest of us. I mean, the song we open the service with comes from the Psalms that say, when I see the wicked prosper, when I see people who are doing the wrong things and they're making more money and they're doing better and their families are in better shape, I go, why am I over here trying to do things Jesus' way? I mean, we envy it a little bit. You wonder, what's the reward of doing my life, doing my finances God's way? Because no one gives you a bonus at work when you say, hey, I'm not going to work overtime so I can go be the dad I need to be. No one comes in and goes, you know what? On top of that, let's give you a little extra money. Thanks for not working that overtime. There's no financial reward for that. No one's giving you a raise because you choose not to work on Sunday and you're going to serve at church on Sunday. There is not a financial reward that comes along because you choose you're going to take care of the needs of the poor. But there is a lot of financial reward to hoarding up wealth. There is a lot of reward to giving your life to making more money and advancing your career. And so what ends up happening is you start to wonder, is it even worth it to be generous? I mean, especially if you face a trial of some kind. And they say, persevere, not just in your ideas about God, persevere in how God says to handle your money. You start to think, I don't know if that's going to work. I'm not sure that makes financial sense for me. And so what the psalmist encourages us is to be still before the Lord, to wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways. And in the poetic language of the Psalms, that means not God's way, their way of doing things. When they carry out their wicked schemes, why are you freaking out? James would say, in the previous verses we heard Ed teach on last time, is humble yourself before the Lord. He will lift you up. It's God who holds your life. He will reward you in due time. The problem is most of us think my time is due. My time is due. God, I figured it out. I've done this a little. My time is due. And James is writing to Christians who are suffering. And he says, I want you to see what is going to be revealed about the way things really are when Jesus returns. He writes to them, now listen. Once again, this isn't dear brothers and sisters. He's talking out there. And he says, now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Now that's pretty harsh. That's pretty harsh language right there. It's what in biblical language is called prophetic language. It is like if you listen to a really hard rock song or something like that, and there's this really aggressive language that comes out, and it's supposed to wake you up and go, whoa, what is that about? They're supposed to get your mind to kind of awaken to a different reality that's going on. It's the way that the prophets in the Old Testament would send warnings to those who had turned from God and would say, you need to turn back to God because there will be a time of weeping and wailing. The way Jesus said it is weeping and gnashing of teeth. There is coming a time. And James is saying, you rich people who are currently laughing in your wealthy, comfortable homes, those who are boasting about the great plans that you've made for the future and how you won't need anybody else because you've already secured it all for yourself. Instead, you should be weeping and wailing when you look to the future. It is not a good and pleasing life ahead. And that's pretty harsh, especially if you remember we're in the top 90% of wage earners in the world. He goes on, your wealth has rotted. Moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded, and it is their corrosion that will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire, for you have hoarded wealth in the last days. Now that sounds reminiscent of the parable Jesus told of this rich fool. You build bigger barns. You hoard up wealth for the future. You didn't know today was your last day. You don't have a future. And the only one who holds your future is the Lord. This is it. And you look foolish when you die in your big old barn. And people walk in and go, look at all this food he didn't eat. You should have done something else with all that wealth, because your wealth is rotted and your gold and silver have corroded. And when people look at that, that will be the testimony about you. I think if he were talking to us, he'd say the excess food in our fridge that we have to throw out because, well, I wanted to eat something else at some other time. The closet's overflowing with more clothes than you could wear in a month. The storage units that are so full of junk that occasionally when you go to clean out, you say, oh, that's where that is. I haven't needed it, haven't thought about it, but there it is. It's here and it's safe. If he talked to me, it'd be, do you need all those subscription services? Have you watched even half of what's on one of the subscription services? All the piles of Amazon boxes that are in your garage you have to take to the recycling center at some point. Right? The receipts for food that you crumble up and throw in the floorboard of your car and then you clean out later. What he's saying is, that's the testimony. And what's the testimony? It wasn't that you didn't have enough money to take care of someone else's needs. The testimony will be all of the things are really tight right now till I look in your garage, until you look in the floorboard of my car. And James goes even harder at wealthy landowners who have mistreated the poor. He says, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvester have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. This is also language from the Old Testament. This is kind of linking back to things. There's a story of the first murder in the Bible of Cain and Abel. And there's a part where God comes to Cain and he says, your brother's blood is crying out from the ground. And James is going, like innocent blood that is spilled, the money you should have paid somebody else, it is crying out to me. It's also language from the Old Testament of the Exodus, where God looks at his people in slavery and says, their cries have come to my ear, the ears of the Lord Almighty, and he's going to do something about this. James is equating mistreating the poor to the injustice of murder and slavery. Now, certainly, I think if you're an employer or you run your own business, these are words we need to pay close attention to. God has a lot to say about how you compensate your employees, how you treat those who work for you. Certainly, if we've got any world leaders in the room, don't see any. This is something other people should also be paying attention to. Here's the problem, though. To most of us, we go, that don't mean nothing to me because I ain't paying any employees. Let's look at the next words. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence, and you have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. Most of us thought the point of money was to live in luxury. The reason I work hard and I hustle hard is so that one day I can, what did the parable say? Eat, drink, and be merry. I can take it easy. That's the point of working hard. That's the point of doing all this, is I get enough money that one day I live in luxury. That is also what a pig thinks when the farmer is fattening it up to kill it. This is the best life I've ever had. I'm eating more food than anyone's ever given me. And even if we want to dismiss these words as though James is simply talking to the super rich, the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos of the world, we need to remember James is not only writing this to the rich who are outside the church, he wants the poor in the church to hear it as a warning. The warning is, do not trust in your money. Do not assume that your money, if it came to you, was for you. Don't just hoard it up to secure your future, but instead humble yourself in submission to King Jesus and do what James says in chapter 4, just before this. He says, you should do the good you know you ought to do. And if you do not do the good you know you ought to do, it is a sin. Because if you don't do the good you know you ought to do, the thing that held you back, your money, it will steal your allegiance and you will begin trusting in it and doing what it says more than what Jesus says. So before we end, we're going to take a moment to consider where our heart is in this. Jason's going to come and lead us in that.
So let's take a moment, and I want us to read from the teaching of Jesus. You're going to see the words on the screen, and when we get to the words in bold, I'll invite you, if you would, to read those out loud with me. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So as followers of Jesus, we want Christ to have our allegiance, our heart. But Jesus says, whatever you give your treasure to, that's who has your heart. So let's pause. And I want us to ask God to reveal to us any ways that we have put more effort into storing up treasure on earth than we have in storing up treasure in heaven. And for you, if that question sounds too vague, maybe you can just ask yourself this: is there any good that you know Jesus would have you do with your money, with your possessions, with your treasure, but you're just unwilling or unable to do it because maybe you can't? Maybe it's that your money is tied up somewhere else. And I know the topic we're discussing today, money, especially in church, it can bring up a lot of feelings of shame, maybe some anger. And I would just encourage you to listen to whatever that is inside of you. Ask God to help you understand, why do these feelings rise up within me when this topic comes up? And then ask Him to lead your heart towards allegiance to Jesus, because in Christ Jesus, we know there's no shame. There's no condemnation in Jesus. So let's take a moment, be honest about where our hearts are regarding to our wealth. King Jesus, we long for you to be our chief joy in this life and not our wealth. So help us to desire treasures in heaven more than we do temporary treasures on earth. And whenever we don't know how to move forward, Lord, give us the humility to ask for help from our brothers and our sisters and open our ears to hear from you. In Jesus' name, amen.
So in between the two sections we looked at today, James says these words: if anyone knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. That's ultimately the guiding principle I just want to leave us with today, because too often what happens is, maybe we end on one end of the pendulum swing or the other, which is we hear Jesus' words about money, and maybe we've run so hard and so fast in the other direction that we just completely dismiss them because we think, I can't leave here and just do this right today. You're probably right. You probably can't just walk out today and make a flip of a switch today. Or others of us hear these words and we think, I want to do that, but not right now. One day, we have a one-day plan in the future of when that's going to happen. And I just want us to hold whatever that thought is, whatever the hesitation is, in tension with anyone who knows the good they ought to do right now. That one, we got to hold that in tension. This seems to be James' point when he looks at traveling merchants who have all these plans for the future. He says to them, I know you plan one day things are going to be different. You don't know that tomorrow's not the last day. And so if there's good you know you ought to do right now, do it right now. And he says to wealthy landowners who are living in self-indulgence and the luxury of today, but they're not thinking about the future because they're not thinking about one day their breath is going to run out. And one day they'll have to stand before the judgment seat of God. And he says, you should be doing the good you know you ought to do today. Because when you stand before God, your money will not save you. And your money can't secure a good and pleasing future in this life, but what it can do is do a lot of good for someone else. A lot of good for someone in need. James has made clear throughout this letter, loving your neighbor means more than just having good vibes and saying, I don't have any ill will towards anyone, so I do love my neighbor. Loving your neighbor means if they have a practical need and you can meet it, you meet it. And I know we all think, I want to be generous. And one day, when money is less tight, one day, when my student loans get paid off, one day, when I'm done saving for a house, one day, once I've got enough for retirement, one day, once the kids are out of the house, once I get this promotion, once the economy turns around, one day I will be generous because then it will make financial sense for me to be generous. I'll meet the needs of others when it makes financial sense for me to do that. And once again, I'm not saying you don't need a wise financial plan around this. In fact, what humility might look like for you is to have the humility to say, I don't know how to plan to do this. Because you've got financial plans. Everybody does. And they're usually based around the obligations you want there to be. You do have financial obligations in this life. The part that might shock many of us is you also have financial obligations to Christ. And have you made a plan for those obligations as well as others? Because James says there is good you ought to do. And ought to means you are obligated to. Where does that obligation come from? It comes from your allegiance to King Jesus, and you said, you get authority in my life, not me. And my pocketbook, and my bank account, and my stock portfolio, and all the different things that I have, Jesus has authority over those things as well. And what he says, and I want to remind you this when we think about, well, it's got to make financial sense to me. He says this to people who are under threat of losing everything. I don't think he's saying to people who have lost their jobs, hey, you need to start meeting other people's needs. They're the ones who need their needs met. But there are other people in the church who could easily say, I could be the next one dragged into court. It does not make financial sense for me to be taking this money and meeting their needs because me and my kids could be next. We could be the next ones. And James goes, if there's good you know you ought to do, it's sin for you not to do it. He's saying, don't become like the rich and powerful who are too busy boasting about their big, beautiful plans for the future and too busy counting their money to listen to the voice of Jesus. You do the good you know you ought to do. And this is why James reminds us at the beginning of the letter, every good and perfect gift, every good and perfect thing you have in your life did not come from you. It came from the Father above. That's why you humble yourself in submission to Him, because the God you serve is a loving and generous God who loves to give good gifts. When we were playing that marble game before, I said the point of board games is, it teaches you to persevere when things get tough. And so there came a point later in the game where I was positioned again and I could send another marble home. And my instant thought was, I know things are tough, but this will kind of teach her. Even when things get tougher, life don't take it easy on you. Life don't care about your plans. And I could send her butt home and make her realize life is tough. Or I could say, you know what the lesson is that she needs more than anything is to know that even though life is tough, and even though life doesn't care about your plans, you have a good and a loving and merciful Father who, when you are struggling, only wants to give you good gifts. That's what would have happened if I knew I'd be preaching a sermon about it later. It's not what happened, but good for you, good for me. Your heavenly Father is a lot more kind and gracious than me. And it's Him who holds your life, not you. It is He who holds your future, not your bank account, not anyone in government, not anyone who sits in Wall Street. It is the Lord Almighty who is reigning and working all things out. And He is asking that you would humble yourself before Him. You would do the good you know you ought to do, even if right now it is scary and it feels like it does not make sense, because it is those who persevere in doing good, even when it's difficult and scary, who become mature and complete, not lacking anything. Now, I want to be clear. That is not a promise that if you give some certain amount of money, God's going to get it back to you 10, 20, 30-fold. What I will say, though, is in my experience, the people who have been most faithful in what God has asked them to do financially, the people who have put God first in all of their things, who have trusted God with their money and have done the good that they know they ought to do, what they have learned is He has always been faithful to provide for us. You know, there was a time recently where my wife and I, we really felt like there was something we needed to do financially. It did not make sense at all. It was just whatever. It felt foolish, just to be truthful about it. And I remember both of us really struggling about it. It was to do good for somebody else. And we just kept talking about it. And I said, I just don't know. We got a lot of young kids at home. I don't know. And then I said, it wasn't me. I think it was the Spirit. I just said as we were talking, I said, you know what the good thing is that we're involved in a community of people who I know are also generous and kind. And this person who needs this gift from us, if we are faithful to them and somehow life is unfair to us later on and life gets hard, there ain't anybody in this community who's letting me and my kids go hungry. And so I don't have to hoard all of this up going, someone's got to take care of my kids in the future. I can be generous because my Father is generous, and so are my brothers and sisters. And it allows you to live in a freedom where you go, I don't have to control the future. Because I know the one who does control the future, and He is good, and He is kind, and He is loving. That kind of life, though, requires a lot of humility that unfortunately much of my life I have not had. And I don't know what that looks like for you. And so I want to give you some time to consider what your next step is with this. And Jason's going to come and lead us in that.